Recording in progress.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third and final webinar in Sustainable Conservation's Climate Resilience Through Regeneration series. Thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Environmental Science Associates, Holland and Knight, and Spotswood Estate Vineyard and Winery for supporting our Spring 2024 webinar series and sharing Sustainable Conservation's vision of stewarding our most precious natural resources for all Californians. I'm Katie Haldeman, and I'm a project director on the Accelerating Restoration team at Sustainable Conservation. Now, for those of you who don't know us, Sustainable Conservation advances the collaborative stewardship of California's land, air, and water for the benefit of nature and people. Every day, we bring together business, landowners, scientists, government, water agencies, nonprofits, and others to advance solutions to steward the natural resources we all depend on in ways that are just and make economic sense. Throughout our spring webinar series, we're exploring how sustainable conservation and our partners are adapting and innovating together to confront climate challenges head-on and build a stronger, more sustainable California. The first two webinars focused on multi-benefit groundwater recharge and soil health. Today, we'll explore ecosystem restoration. Before we dive into today's discussion, we'd like to get to know our audience a bit more. So we have a few poll questions for you. Please take a moment to submit your answers and make sure you scroll down all the way to see all the questions. Feel free to also use the chat if you don't see your answers reflected here. Great. So thank you for everyone for participating in the poll. Let's see, it looks like we have a strong showing from the Bay Area, about 28%, as well as Sacramento Valley. Those are our top geographic attendees here. And then we also have a little bit of Northern California, a little bit of San Joaquin, and Southern California, coastal areas. We've got a great mix of government folks, nonprofits, business, academia, and other groups. And finally, let's see, we've got a mix. Most folks have about an average level of knowledge about ecosystem restoration, but we also have some experts and some beginners. So it just sounds like a great mix of attendees. And thanks everybody for participating. Now, before we get into the conversation with our expert panelists, Sandy, I just wanted to give a bit of background on how sustainable conservation supports restoration efforts and how we partner with both government and NGOs like CalTrout, which Sandy is a part of. And also, we'll try to leave time for audience questions and answers towards the end of the webinar. So if any questions arise during the discussion, please feel free to add them to the Q&A box. Next. Okay, so you all might be familiar with permitting in California, but in case you're not, for anyone who wants to do a restoration project in this state, they have to go to 8 or 9 different agencies or through different processes to be able to get their project done. And this can be a really daunting process for landowners who are trying to be proactive. Our regulatory system also doesn't distinguish between development and environmentally beneficial projects. So coordinating and simplifying the permitting process for ecosystem restoration is a key tool to help meet restoration needs and allow for more opportunities to get stewardship work done. Now, sustainable conservation has been working for several years, collaborating with the agencies to put restoration on a separate permitting pathway from development projects, and those development projects that do not restore ecosystems. And one of the ways that we put restoration on a separate path is that we use both the California legislative process to create new permitting pathways, and we also use agencies' administrative processes to develop pre-written or programmatic permits. Now, programmatic permits are approvals written in advance to cover a wide variety of the most commonly done and highest priority projects. Now, over the years, sustainable conservation has been doing this work. We've gone from creating pathways for small-scale projects to now having pathways in place or developing pathways for large-scale projects, many thousands of acres in size. And just to give you a brief example of what we're working on right now, we're currently sponsoring a bill at the state legislature to further simplify permitting with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And we're also helping to organize support for a bill that would renew a simplified California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, pathway for restoration. Now, what types of projects might be covered by this separate pathway for restoration? Here's an example of some of the eligible project types. And it's things that are primarily focused on aquatic and riparian areas. And that's typically where the permitting is most complex due to the number of agencies involved in regulating impacts to wetlands, waterways, and the species that depend on those resources. Now, Sandy's going to talk in more detail about what CalTrout does, but I just first wanted to show an example of an area that has a soon to be implemented restoration project and explain how our work helps partners like CalTrout get projects done at a lower cost and more quickly. So I recently took a trip out to the upper part of the Santa Margarita River in northern San Diego County, and the Santa Margarita is one of CalTrout's high priority rivers for restoring anadromous steelhead populations, partly because it historically supported populations of steelhead, and the river has a nice natural channel, which makes it an ideal place to benefit from restoration efforts. The upper part of the river is also protected by the Santa Margarita River Ecological Preserve, operated by the Wildlands Conservancy. So there's great opportunity to protect this area. Now there is currently a bridge that's acting as a fish passage barrier. As you can see here, the road goes directly through the waterway, and it impedes passage to fish. So improving the fish passage here would open up steelhead access for 12 miles upstream of upstream habitat, allowing the fish to reproduce and develop up there. So this project and many others that CalTrout is planning to do or already implemented have used restoration permitting pathways that sustainable conservation has helped the agencies to put in place, saving many hours of staff time and grant funds, as well as resources. So just one example, this project I'm showing up here, it was able to use a pre-written permit with one of the agencies, and that can allow for approval in 30 to 60 days rather than 135 days or more. And the NOAA Restoration Center, who helps implement the permit, is said each project can save up to $64,000 in consulting fees and agency staff time by using that expedited approval pathway. So that's just one example of how our work complements and helps CalTrout do their work. And finally, as you can probably tell from my previous slides, we have recognized that permitting can be complicated and confusing, and there's a lot of information out there, and the process can be improved with better organization and information sharing. And that's why Sustainable Conservation built an accelerating restoration specific website in collaboration with, thank you, the link's also in the chat, in collaboration with regulatory agencies to house important information for successful permitting, including agency contact information, guidance documents, application forms, and a tool to help select the appropriate environmental protections for your project. And with that, I want to hand it over to Sandy to introduce herself and talk more about the work she does with CalTrout. Sandy?
Very good. Thank you, Katie. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today, and thanks for the invitation. I'm Sandy Jacobsen. I'm the director for the South Coast and Sierra regions for California Trout. I'm based in San Diego, and I've been with the organization for about 10 years now. Come from an academic background and then moved into biofuels and then into conservation and directly implementing restoration projects for the last decade. In the South Coast, we work in watersheds in San Diego County, Orange County, Riverside County, and then all the way up the coast through LA County, Ventura, and Santa Barbara counties. We have offices not only in San Diego, but also in Ventura, where we focus on endangered steelhead recovery, native trout protection, and restoration projects that support healthy watersheds. In the Sierra, it's a little bit different. It's inland fisheries. It's really dramatic mountains and landscape. Our work focuses on protecting source waters, meadows, and native trout. Our office there is in the town of Mammoth Lakes, and it's in the heart of the Eastern Sierra. I'll tell you a little bit more about these projects as we go on.
Thanks for the introduction. And so I've heard that there's a new state listing for the Southern California steelhead. Can you tell us a little bit more about that new state listing and how CalTrout was involved in that listing process? And what does it mean for the species and for restoration in Southern California?
The petition to list southern steelhead as an endangered species under the state ESA called CISA is specifically for the listing area from Santa Maria River down south to San Diego County. And this petition was led by California Trout. Russell Marlowe is our senior project manager in the Ventura office. who really did the heavy lifting on this petition. It went through each successive step in front of the Fish and Game Commission, and then moved forward into the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They did their year-long status review. And what they found is what was also in our petition, is that there really is a decline in southern steelhead that has been ongoing for many years now, almost a century. And also the trend is not reversing towards extinction. So essentially, from a number of scientific sources, the danger of extinction for southern steelhead is between 20 and 50 years. It's been federally listed since 1997. So there's been about 25 years of kind of trying to reverse that effect, yet only 177 adult steelhead have been documented in 25 years across the ESA listing area. So it's clear that we really need to accelerate and augment our capability to allow this iconic species to recover.
Well, thank you very much for that. I'm curious too, how is climate change affecting Southern California specifically, and what does that mean for endangered steelhead, and what other additional challenges does the species face because of climate change?
I think climate change really has a lot of tentacles into many areas. In terms of fisheries and landscape scale restoration along riparian areas and waterways, it has to do with climatic influences of rainfall, of floods, of drought, and some of the actions that we've taken, especially in more developed areas of Southern California in terms of building more obsolete dams, that this has prevented some of the natural erosion control that natural sediment transport and hydrology provides for these ephemeral rivers in the southern part of the state. So in terms of steelhead, anytime that you can allow them to express their full life history migrating between the ocean and the inland headwaters where they spawn and rear, which typically might be 30 miles inland, they can make that trip multiple times. And in terms of climate change, where mobility is really the name of the game for them to be able to move around into different locations to escape drought influences and also take advantage of really expansive habitats and ecosystem level processes such as estuaries and nearshore oceans, that it will really benefit them in terms of responding and resiliency to climate change. And just one more note on that is that they are highly adapted to higher temperatures. And so this really is a valuable ecological advantage, especially as warmer waters may progress further north along the coast and inland, that these steelhead really have already had a long time to adapt to these conditions and might provide us insight into what those factors are that will help their more northern relatives survive as well.
Oh, that's fascinating. And it sounds like doing things like opening up additional spawning, rearing habitat and removing barriers will just give the species a better chance to find those cooler areas of water, or just make them more resilient to a changing climate. Well, great. Let's see. So you might have answered this a little bit before, but how, and this is a good segue, how do the habitat restoration projects that CalTrout does and implements make Southern California steelhead more resilient to climate change?
And on a couple of different levels. So one that we were just talking about, and one of the major threats to southern steelhead persistence is barriers. So if you can remove the barriers, that allows them free passage up and down a river so that they can migrate between their growth areas in the ocean and coming up into the spawning and rearing areas and the freshwater headwaters that might be spring fed in the mountains. So that's one. We also protect native trout. These are the remnant populations of steelhead runs from 100 years ago. They're trapped up in the mountains of Southern California and along the spine in they're extremely valuable genetic resource that we want to protect, but they're very susceptible to wildfires and drought, kind of going back to those factors within climate change. So we try to do our best to increase the geographic and the genetic diversity of those populations as well. Invasive species have been another issue that with some of the warmer water and aberrant, kind of pooling in watersheds or streams that have traditionally been dry most of the year and then just run in the winter months, that these invasive species, they outcompete the native fish for resources that they need to survive, whether it's food or cover or whatever, or their young offspring. And so we really are taking a very concerted effort to manage these invasive species where they arise in these watersheds. And then just on a broader scale, we really try, these are big issues. We really try to operate at a landscape scale through coalitions. And so, working in multiple parts of a watershed, whether it's in the estuary/lagoon, depending on whether it's open or closed, kind of the lower part of watersheds, which are migratory corridors, but maybe not have the best habitat, but then moving up into the upper elevations where there's adequate habitat for them. Each one has their challenges, and we're trying to address that on a watershed scale in multiple high priority watersheds that through the federal recovery plan, which came out in 2012, that laid out that framework. It's non-regulatory, but it's a framework by which we operate and set up our strategic plan in the South Coast.
Wow, that's great. It sounds like you, in some sense, are really helping these regulatory agencies meet their mission to not only protect species but help restore their habitat and recover the species. So that seems like, CalTrout fits that very great niche where it's not the job of the government necessarily or private industry. You come in and work with the community and just achieve these great outcomes. So
it's Katie, it's an important part. You bring up a really good point, is that we work so closely with the state and federal agencies, with local governments, with foundations, all of the above, not only in a grantee or a funding relationship, but also operationally, really we have very common goals. And another thing that CalTrout, we manage two different coalitions along the coast. One is in San Diego, the other one is in Ventura. And these bring together, over 30 different entities, whether they're state and federal agencies, RCDs, nonprofits, conservation groups. Everybody comes to the table as they're able. Even though we have different missions, we really try to find that common ground where the steelhead recovery actions that we seek to implement are really community-based projects. They might improve aging infrastructure, like under an interstate, remove it, like what in Santa Margarita, what you showed earlier is to remove a flood-prone spot and increase public access to 18 miles of a preserve, while removing the last barrier to steelhead migration in the Santa Margarita. So it's really a great job to be in, being able to make meaningful change, but really operating through interdisciplinary teams where science is at the base, but you have these good outcomes that you can monitor. And that's really, as you know, that's one of the things that we're trying to do, is to increase the effectiveness monitoring of these projects as well.
Wow, that's great. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about the role of the local community or coalitions in the restoration projects you've been involved with. Are they helping with revegetation? Are they helping gather support for the projects? Or how do you work with those groups?
I think all of the above. I think you meet people where they are. And sometimes it's a matter of going door to door. Sometimes you have community meetings where they're able to understand what the project entails and what the local benefits are. It's everything from private landowners, working with them directly, to larger counties where they have their mission of protecting life and property. How does your project fit in with that in some of these more urbanized areas? And we find that to be effective, that we really put science at the core to make sure that they're, the best and most reasonable solutions for that, but also try to incorporate the different visions of the community themselves, in particular working with the local tribal nations and the private landowners and conservation groups that have a really direct interest in the outcome of a particular project.
That's great. So yeah, when you involve those local groups, and you get a better project, and you get more engagement, and it works out better all around. So very happy to hear you all do that. I'm wondering about the importance of tribal engagement with your projects, and how that has improved project outcomes, and even how has the tribal engagement process you all do evolved over the years on the projects you've worked on?
Yeah, I think tribal engagement is absolutely essential to the success of a project. There are multiple ways that we can do this, really engaging at the early design, the initial site visits, really getting the input either from traditional ecological knowledge, oral written history that might inform how you go about restoring a particular site. Again, in the context of a larger community, it's great. It's just essential to get all sorts of different viewpoints and really understand historically how things were, and that group's vision of what a restored area looks like. In terms of specific projects where we've worked with Pechanga on the Santa Margarita River bridge replacement, this has been really a learning experience and just wonderful to work with them as we discovered cultural items as construction was beginning last year, that we literally pivoted the bridge, the realignment of that bridge within a year to accommodate their request and their wishes of not, impacting that site. And we are just heading back into construction in a couple of months there. In the case of the I-5 and the Metrolink, these are two large barriers in the lower part of the San Juan Creek watershed in Orange County. In the city of San Juan Capistrano, the Ahashiman, that is their traditional lands where steelhead ran and for millennia. And so working with them at the outset has really been an integral part of setting that project up for success as well. And then, even moving up into the Sierra. So we're starting some meadow restoration and integrated forest management activities up in Glass Mountain area. And so working with the Kotsutika and the Bishop Paiute and the Valley Paiute tribes there, that as we even start entertaining what those solutions are going to be for meadow restoration at the headwaters there, everyone comes to the table to voice what their opinion is and how things should move, and then we can integrate that and move forward from there. So they're very different. And as far as tribal engagement, I think in Southern California, we're really learning how to do that now. And in Northern California, our colleagues have had a bit more kind of a longer experience in how to engage meaningfully in projects all the way from design to implementation.
Oh, that's great. So it sounds like, yeah, different areas of the state can learn from each other, but also the devil's in the details, and each project
Absolutely.
is different, right? And each area of the state has its own different folks engaged. Right. So then looking to the future, what other projects does CalTrout have on deck in Southern California, and how are sustainable conservation sponsored efficient permitting pathways helping you to do your work?
Right. So let me kind of separate that into a couple of things. So the one that you're showing right now is a really good example of taking out the two last barriers in Trabuco Creek, which provides access from the ocean all the way up to where that white star is in the upper Trabuco. These are really, it's really great trout habitat up there. And so taking out these two barriers, they're hydraulic solutions. So they actually provide fishways and ramps up one side of the river. And not only do they improve the existing infrastructure, but also, especially in the case of the Metrolink bridge, that's a railroad bridge, will actually stabilize some of that, the supporting infrastructure, and reduce the erosion that has happened, that you can see kind of where that bend is down in as the creek heads off in the kind of the right side there. So there are different sorts of barriers. I think you also have a picture of maybe Ringe Dam, and that's in Malibu Creek in Los Angeles County. And that is a state parks project that is now going through 90% design for removal. And this is a big, big project, and it requires a lot of community effort and engineering as well. So that's a kind of a derelict dam that is just become a sediment trap of that is slated for removal over the next 10 years, basically, as soon as that design comes into fruition. So that, there's different ways of either removing barriers, like in Santa Margarita, you can literally take it out and replace it with a steel bridge. In Trabuco, it's different. You do hydraulic designs. It's kind of the art and science of engineering hydraulics. And then in the case of Matilaha and Ringe Dam, you literally dismantle them in a very careful and permitted way. So then getting to the second part of your question is that the permitting, and especially with sustainable conservation, what you've done to aid us in implementing, especially these larger projects, is really important. So the regional permits that we use, the NOAA small restoration for I-5, we're looking to the general order, the State Water Board. There's a couple of new ones that are coming on that will be very much applicable for our restoration projects in Southern California. And just one more thing to add to that is, in addition like what I mentioned before, in addition to removing barriers, other threats are very real for steelhead recovery as well, in healthy watersheds, essentially. And so that includes projects that we do for habitat restoration, for invasive species removal, for water quality improvement, et cetera. And even the barrier removal projects, they have components of those as well. And so bringing these all together to make a healthy ecosystem is the goal. And the healthy fisheries is very much a part of that overall goal.
Wow. Thank you, Sandy. Yeah, you all have a lot of really big and exciting projects up and down the state. So this is, can't wait to see these projects some of these new ones break ground and see the benefits to the species. So I know you also work on projects in the Sierra and other areas. And if you haven't touched on this already enough, could you speak to some of the regional differences you've seen working on restoration projects in different areas?
Absolutely. So Katie, if you could flip over to the photo of the Owens.
Oh yeah.
If you can, I think that says it all. It's like a picture is much better than a lot of words. But it just shows the Owens River in its glory with the mountains behind it. This is a classic by Mark Utter from Golden State Flycasters. So, when we work in the Sierra, if you could go one more, Katie.
Okay.
We also.
Oops, sorry.
Oops.
I think I don't have the next.
Oh, okay, that's fine. So anyway, so what we do is we work on meadows. So meadows are essential for, sustaining biodiversity, for seasonally storing and releasing water. So you have cold, clean water that runs into these larger rivers and receiving waters. And also adjacent to that, we do fuels reduction and forest health projects that also aid in creating larger fuel breaks for wildfire, but also larger refuge areas during fires for wildlife, which use those actively. So between those two, with forest health, meadow restoration, it's all about carbon. So the carbon sequestration below ground in healthy meadows is extremely important. And as the really dense stands of forest are managed for kind of a sustainable future in terms of wildland fire, that you have avoided avoided wildfire emissions, or AWE. So that's also an important form of carbon mitigation as well. If you can bring those together and actually use some of that biomass for conversion into renewable energy, you've got an incredible chain and an opportunity to make a really an important impact within some of these mountain meadow areas that are due for some restoration as well.
Great. Wow. Such a diversity of work. It's really fascinating.
Yes.
And
And
what
then
a
the native
beautiful state.
trout.
Yeah.
It's all about, from a fisheries point of view, that the watersheds, they support, a healthy watersheds support native trout fisheries. So we're working in Lahontan, as well as the golden trout, and there's just really a diversity, not only species but of native trout there as well, that we preserve.
Wow. What a great state we live in, and so glad you all are doing so much to help restore ecosystems. Now I have just a couple more questions. What's one thing that you want the audience to take away from this conversation? And what's one thing that keeps you doing this work?
It's the goal of having a positive impact in the environment that leads to sustainability. I think a lot of people share that in almost everything that they do, whether it's directly implementing or designing projects, engineering, just from the regional presence that you have on the webinar here, as well as people's backgrounds. Everybody comes at it from a slightly different way, whatever suits their skills and their interest levels. But essentially, as citizens, it's really any opportunity that we have to make a positive difference, it's worth pursuing. And especially when it's in the context of a strategic plan that has overall really clearly articulated goals that you can identify, when the metrics of when you've made them is also really important. So it's a challenge, but creating interdisciplinary teams that come from different walks of life is really important, I think, to a successful project.
Well, great. Yes. And one of the things that is rewarding with our work is that we see projects use some of these permitting pathways we put in place, and we see the cost savings, or the collaboration that comes with having these permits, and that's also quite motivating. And it is help folks solve their permitting problems.
I can't tell you how many times I've thanked you guys like when I'm working on a permit, and it just seems to go through a lot easier. So I have to say we all very much appreciate the work that Sustainable Conservation does, and all your partners to help us.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, we are very grateful for all of the support we've had over the years. And finally, just to wrap up with our discussion, how can folks get more involved in restoration projects in their communities?
Oh, there are a lot of ways. So I think of a couple different ways, actually. So on a broader scale is participating and using your voice when you can, supporting particular bills, supporting initiatives, supporting propositions that will lead to results that are compatible with sustainable environment and restoration, I think, on a large scale. That's one. Volunteering. So we have volunteer opportunities where you can get out in the field, or you can do whatever, wherever you're at. We usually have something that will probably match that. And that's true not only in the San Diego office, but also Ventura is very active in public outreach, and then also in the Sierra. And that's just in the southern half of the state. There are all sorts of opportunities in the more northern part of the state as well. So I would say, volunteer, get active that way. Teach your kids, bring them to these state fairs and community events where they can see all these people doing these things. And there's also, for students, we have different curricula, different opportunities to get out and see what it's all about. That's how I started growing up in Minnesota, was out, fishing and out on the water at a very early age. And that translated into moving into Colorado and living there for a long time. And then finally out into Southern California, where I really saw the opportunities to make a difference with some of the limiting resources that we have in the population density. So it was just a kind of a visionary kind of, it's a vision that one acquires, I think, through time, especially being in different geographies, to see how things, the specific elements that are important for sustaining ecosystems in each place.
Well, thank you, Sandy, for this great discussion. I've learned a lot. And I think from here, we're going to move into the audience Q&A. And if folks are interested, they can put their questions in the Q&A box and we'll do our best to answer them. Let's see. Okay, so I'm just going to take some of these as they come in here. I'll read them out loud. Does anybody distinguish between public trust assets and any private property that might be involved? Let's see. I'm not too sure about how to answer this one, but I can speak from the permitting side. Is we know that there's quite a bit of private property in California, and we've specifically helped the agencies set up permitting pathways that could be used on either public or private land, because we didn't want to exclude any one type of land ownership. And I know that folks often want to make sure that there's buy-in from not only the land, the property owners that you're directly doing the project at where you're directly doing the project, but also any adjacent landowners will often need to be involved in the project or have their buy-in. But I don't know, Sandy, can you speak to this one at all?
So I think there's a couple of different ways that question could be interpreted. I'm not sure exactly what was kind of the driving question there, but in terms of the public trust and the doctrine, it immediately comes to mind our work with our partners on Mono Lake and that voluntary decision with LADWP and the conservation parties of CDFW and Mono Lake Committee to limit and gauge the diversions that go back to Los Angeles instead of going into Mono Lake and its tributaries. So that was an incredible step forward in terms of the application of the public trust doctrine years ago that ultimately led to the recent settlement, which has been sustained, which is currently underway and that we're part of. And again, in a kind of a separate vein, not to go too much into the weeds here, but CalTrout does work with a lot of private landowners as well. And there's the intersection with public trust doctrine, but also the opportunities to work with these landowners to improve issues on their land, whether it's migratory, habitat, water, et cetera. So the intersection to make meaningful changes is quite significant, I think.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Sandy. Let's see, we've got how do local GSAs, groundwater sustainability agencies, I believe, GSAs collaborate with restoration permitting for local landowner riparian restoration endeavors? I don't know specifically how they might overlap. I know that projects like floodplain restoration, riparian restoration, and others can help slow, spread, and sink water on a project and help with groundwater recharge. But I don't know if anyone else can speak to that. Sandy, any thoughts there on GSAs? Do you work with them in the Central Valley at all, or?
Yeah, I think throughout the state, definitely. And so I know we do have a number of applications down here as well. And that I think your points are well taken as far as the different modes of how the groundwater is either modeled how it arrives at more of a surface flow and its the beneficial uses overall that the State Water Board has in their basin plans. So complicated question, definitely. I just don't know exactly what the permitting applications would be to that.
Thank you. Let's see. Okay, we've got a question here about changes in coastal currents and upwelling. Are there any changes in ocean currents within 10 miles of the mouth of the Santa Margarita River? Or I guess I'm guessing the question is how are maybe any changes in ocean conditions impacting rivers inland and fish populations. This one I can't specifically speak to because I don't have a strong fisheries background, but you know.
So what I can say about that, again, there are a lot of variables, and but to treat it at a very high level with the California current cold coming all the way down south towards into Baja, as that retracts and the water becomes higher temperature, that this definitely will have an impact and its interaction with the upwelling and the food distribution and probably, kelp beds. So we don't know exactly where steelhead and other salmonids go when they exit in a particular river, whether they go into the next watershed or further up. And so any local changes in oceanic conditions will definitely have an impact on these larger fish, the ocean-going fish, but how far they travel and how far out into the ocean, into what thermocline they use to migrate around will be really important. We're very, we think a lot about decadal oscillations, rainfall, ocean conditions. This is really important, but we just don't have adequate information on this right now.
Okay, thank you. It's another complicating factor with it's not just the rivers, I guess, it's also the ocean.
Yeah.
And that's the one special thing about these anadromous fish is that they live in the ocean and in inland too. So extra complicated.
And, if I can just quickly add one more thing to that. So obviously one of the really important interface points are the estuaries / lagoons. So where that transition happens, if it's closed due to sandbars like it is in many of the Southern California rivers, so that's a lagoon. And then when there's sufficient force to drive that sandbar out and break it open, break the berm, then that's the gateway where the steelhead actually come in and exit during that sort of event in the winter. They usually only happen a couple of times a year. Within the lagoon or the estuary, the food source is really important, and how that estuary, what those micro and macro environments are. And so we hope to set up a study with the Jacobs lab, Dr. Dave Jacobs at UCLA, so that they do environmental DNA collections in estuaries along the California coast. And then instead of just probing for one particular or two particular species of interest, they do metabarcoding so that you can look at an assemblage of species to try to understand what those dynamics are. And I think that's going to be really important going forward to try to understand, especially, under conditions of climate change and particular events that might happen, how this impacts these really important interface points between land and the ocean.
Thank you. And there's a lot of estuaries up, I know, in Southern California, but up and down the coast, have beautiful spots, and that'll benefit from restoration work. So it's good to know. Moving on here, we've got a question about why is I'm not sure what specifically this is referencing, but why might Northern California be more experienced than Southern California? I'm not sure if that's related to restoration or tribal engagement. It might be related to tribal engagement. I know just my own personal knowledge is that I know sometimes the state may provide more funding to Northern California, or they might have in the past. That might also be true of the feds who um, transfer some money over to the state. But I don't know, Sandy, you know, obviously you're very experienced in Southern California as well, so maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
Yes, we have our Northern California offices really have been active with tribal nations and in design all the way into implementation for a number of years. And so I think that some of the, that funding stream, some of the specific fisheries initiatives that are being implemented may lead to that sort of kind of that jumpstart of identifying best practices of how to engage different communities as you're going through a particular project. And so as we transition in Southern California from design into implementation of these larger projects, these are lessons learned and really critical pieces of information to make for a successful project.
Great. Thank you. Let's see here. Have you dealt with floodplain development permits for work in the FEMA floodway on your projects? And we have not set up, Sustainable Conservation hasn't set up any permitting pathways with FEMA, but I know that the local agencies sometimes get involved. Sandy, can you speak to that FEMA permitting at all?
We've had to do an update for like a CLOMA or whatever for the Santa Margarita River project, but I would say that my experience in that is pretty limited, and I'm just probably would leave that best to other people to speculate on best ways of implementing floodplain permitting.
Agreed. Yes. Let's see. So we've got a question here about to what extent do you use devices like easements on private land when dealing with owners of private land where critical habitat is located? Now, I'm not sure if critical habitat has a very specific meaning. I know it in a regulatory context, but maybe Sandy, you could speak to a bit more about how you deal with private landowners or acquiring easements where needed to make a project happen.
Well, I can give you one example, and again, this will be kind of a not a broad example, but in the Santa Margarita River bridge replacement project with the Wildlands Conservancy, one of the conditions of the Fish and Wildlife Service or the federal biological opinion was a particular easement structure. And so we're just in the process of moving through that in terms of how that's managed, who's the responsible party and what those actions are. So I think they can be fairly complicated, but they're basically intended to preserve the conservation element once a project has been completed. And so I think, the intent is pretty clear, and there's probably some variety on how they're implemented by agency.
Great. Yes, thank you. Thanks very much for that. Let's see, in terms of on the same topic of maybe private land ownership, or we have a question about how can we control private party influence interference in restoration activities. Now, I'm guessing this might be in the case of if you've got California Environmental Quality Act compliance or something where you have public comments on the project. But I guess, I mean, I could speak to this one in that if a project proponent or a project does early engagement with both tribal entities and has a strong relationship with the local community and local coalitions, then you're not really going to need to control their influence or be as concerned about their influence being problematic, because it's really a collaboration, and they're helping inform the project. So yeah, I don't know, Sandy, if you can speak to again, when you bring in local coalitions or members of the public, like, into the process of developing a project or implementing a project, or if there's anything else you want to say on that.
Well, I'm kind of reaching back into a couple of our projects where
Yeah.
private landowners are prominent parts of the project themselves. And so what comes to mind is in one case, it's the initial design of the project. So to get people involved, the private landowners initially is really important. Secondly, is to gauge the impact of the project, any longer kind of longer term impacts it might have on that landowner. So to try to have that discussion upfront and early, and try to come to agreement on what sorts of actions will be taking place after the project is completed. Another one is often has to do with construction access, is simply the mechanics of implementing a large scale construction project. These are really important. It usually affects neighborhoods or specific landowners in particular. And so again, it's just having that conversation frequent and early on, so that those parameters are understood. In terms of other private landowners, I think of some of our more northern projects and water quantity related ones up in the Shasta, that the landowners have been on the land for a long time, that these are ranchers, whatever, and they have a really extensive historical background, but also a focused idea of what their current needs are. And I think it's working through that conversation on a group basis. And often it turns into coalitions where you have the discussions to come to a consensus on how you're going to solve a particular problem.
Great. Thank you very much. And I think we just have time for maybe one more question here. And this might be a good one to wrap up with. What would you say some of the most important ecosystem restoration projects or issues there are to work on going forward in California?
To California broadly. So the regions are very different, and so they're going to have different requirements and different needs and threats for particular species. But overall, I would say some of, like, taking the dams out, that's going to have some of the biggest impact. We've seen what's happening with the Klamath Dam removal already, and there are several other targeted throughout the states. And CalTrout has a very strong dams out campaign that targets specific ones that are defunct and are on the list for removal. Again, and it's source waters. Keeping our source waters pristine as possible and the habitat that accompanies them. These are the areas, the meadows, the source waters that are really important, that provide water for most of the population. The overall watershed health is really engaging the public to understand what you can do on a daily basis or on a bigger scale. In addition, and teaching your kids and the future generations of how to make sustainable watersheds, how they function, and also just resilience to the impacts of climate change. They're real, and we're feeling them now. And so the projects that we can implement that protect the public and our watersheds and the wildlife are really important.
Well, great. Thank you very much. And we got to wrap up here. We had a lot of great engagement from our audience. So thank you everyone for submitting your questions. I apologize if we couldn't get to all of them. But thank you, Sandy, for being with us today and sharing your expertise on this important topic. We greatly appreciate it. And thank you everyone who tuned in. We really hope you enjoyed the conversation. This was our last webinar in our spring 2024 series before we take the summer off, but you all can access all past webinar recordings on our website or stay updated on our blog. And if you'd like to follow Sustainable Conservation's work, please find us on social media, subscribe to our email list, or consider a donation. And these webinars and our program work are fueled by generous contributions of organizations and individuals like you. All new and increased donations are currently being matched dollar for dollar, so please consider donating by visiting suscon.org/give or by scanning the QR code on your screen. Thank you again for joining, and we hope to see you again for our fall series. Have a great day.